Welcome back to another episode of Christian Natural Health. Today, I am very thrilled to have Seth Gruber with us. Seth is the founder of the fastest growing pro-life organization in the country, the White Rose Resistance, and a speaker, documentary filmmaker, and author. His new documentary film, The 1916 Project, releases this fall on streaming services and is currently being screened all over the US. It's an unprecedented deep dive on the opening of eugenicist Margaret Sanger's first illegal birth control clinic in 1916 and connects the dots from Sanger all the way to every cultural crisis and leftist movement threatening our culture and democracy today. The book releases the first week of September. Welcome, Seth. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren. Great introduction. Well said.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just finished your book earlier today, and I feel very red-pilled as we in the Matrix. This is such a big picture concept. I never knew that all of these things were as interconnected as you described in there.
Yep.
This might be a big ask, but is there a way that you can kind of give like a 130,000 foot overview for our listeners on connecting the dots between like the philosophy of evolution, survival of the fittest, abortion, sexual revolution, socialism, even modern environmentalism? Like, how are all of these things that seem so disparate actually connected to each other?
Yeah, great question, Lauren. It's been called the long walk through the institutions. It's been called cultural Marxism.
Right.
It's been called neo-Malthusianism. It's been called the culture of death. I sometimes call it Klaus Schwabism or Hillary Clintonism. It's it's all the same thing. Okay.
Right.
Margaret Sanger famously had on her magazine in 1914 the headline, "No gods, no masters. No gods, no masters." So the serpent in Genesis 3, ye shall be as gods. God's holding out on you. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, of the apple, then your eyes shall be opened and ye shall be as gods. And so apparently Eve's eyes were closed, Lauren. God was holding things out. He was holding back. He didn't want what was best for Adam and Eve. And so the serpent says, if you do the apple and you do it my way, then you'll see. Then you'll see the reality that God's hiding from you. So Eve got woke. You have to understand that Eve eating the apple is the first woke story. That is the first example of wokeification. That's literally what every woke person says. It's what wokeism teaches, actually, Lauren, is that there are hidden realities and systems of oppression that you don't see because you're a conservative. And so you got to get woke. And part of what they mean by getting woke is actually seeing reality for what it is. So the Garden of Eden is the first woke story. Ever since then, man has been trying to put himself on the throne of his own life and say there's no gods and no masters, which is another way of saying I'm the only god and master that matters.
Right.
That would be the best way to summarize this. Herbert Schlossberg wrote a wonderful book a long, long time ago called Idols for Destruction. And he said, bloodthirsty gods produce bloodthirsty people. He said, if someone thinks that chance rules the universe, his actions are likely to appear random. He said, if people increasingly believe that malevolence rules, we can expect more human sacrifice. If there is a decline in the number of people who believe that God is love, we can expect fewer who think that actions of love are moral imperatives. So Schlossberg says, for any individual, therefore, or society, the religious questions are the ultimate ones that govern human conduct, whether they believe it or not.
Right.
The way to summarize that would be all human conflict is ultimately theological.
Right.
All human conflict is ultimately theological. The Bible says eternity is written on the heart of man. 1 Corinthians 15:26 says the last enemy to be defeated is death. So we can't help but get away from these eternal religious longings that we have because we're fundamentally a religious being. That's why God says in one of the 10 commandments, don't worship other gods. Why the commandment? What's the assumption behind the commandment of no idolatry? It's that you're a worshiping kind of being, man, woman. You're a worshiping kind of being, and you're gonna worship something. So make sure it's not demons, okay? And make sure that it's Yahweh. Because if you rip God from a society, we don't walk around with coexist bumper stickers on our butt. It's not that we achieve a utopian, libertarian heaven of coexistence between all the different religions. No, guess what? We just go back to demon worship. We don't become less religious. Our religion just becomes really kooky, weird, and demonic, and we begin to resemble every neo-pagan society whose society and civilization was destroyed because of the same kind of woke ideologies that are now so normal in the American American Republic, and they call it political correctness. But it's really just communist propaganda writ small. And I can share more about that later if you'd like. And so what are we facing? We're facing the 6,000, 7,000 year, if you're a young Earth creationist, attempt to say, I need that apple, because I need to see reality for what it really is. And there's a different experience out there, and there's a different reality that if I would just shirk off my religious longings for God and shirk off these moral duties that come along with Christianity, then I'll find a way back into Eden without God. I can find a way back into Eden riding on the back of my own gods, which is why one of the most significant influences of some of Margaret Sanger's best friends was a man named Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was one of the fathers of the free love movement in California, actually. And he was a member of the Frankfurt School, which is where we get critical race theory and critical theory, by the way. Yeah. And Herbert Marcuse, him and Wilhelm Reich together were the fathers of the free love movement. And he said, the way back into the garden is to take another bite of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, sex is salvation. And I can live however I want to live. I can get back to that eternal life. This is why Sanger once said, through sex, mankind may attain that great spiritual illumination, which will transform the world and light up the only path to an earthly paradise. In other words, Sanger fully acknowledged that for her, sex was salvation. So we will look for ways to feel saved. We will look for ways to feel redeemed. That somehow we can like just put layers and layers of comfort and indulgence over that still small voice that's our conscience that says there's something wrong with you, you need help. And we'll just continue to coat it over with orgies, with abortions, with sex, with orgasms, with drugs, with food, and just remind ourselves that we'll be able to figure this out, but we can't. And we have the most medicated, depressed, and suicidal generation in American history right now. They're called Gen Z. I think that Americans have eaten from the fruit of the tree of the sexual revolution and found that it's a disgusting taste, and they're spitting it out. So it's time for the church and Christians who have the way, the truth, and the life, we know the answers to these questions, to be as bold and unrelenting in offering those answers to the next generation as the architects of the culture of death and the leftists and the humanists are to proclaim their pagan religion to the next generation. So that's a beginning of an answer on your amazing show here of how all this stuff is connected. It's fundamentally theological. And until Christians realize that even the left uses all this theological and religious terms to describe their paganism, we won't be able to reverse engineer the sexual revolution and the insanity unfolding before our eyes, and the parents listening to this show who are very afraid to hand this culture to their children and grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love the big picture way of trying to fit it all together, because as you say, everybody's going to ultimately worship something. One of the things that you said in the book was that essentially what you just said about the idea that everybody's trying to find their way back into the garden. And you said the very next time that happened was in the Tower of Babel. Can you explain how you connected that as an attempt? Because that was I'd never heard that description before.
Yeah, I know. This is why we need pastors, right? Amen. Who are willing to really preach the full counsel of God.
Sure.
I mean, so, you go back to Genesis, right? And this is the first major offensive to get back into the garden is in Genesis 11, right? And so the people settled on the plain of Shinar, and I think we should say that settling in and of itself was an act of rebellion, for God had commanded us to fill the earth and subdue it. Right. But the greater rebellion was in what they attempted to build, right? And so in Genesis 11, 3-4, it says, they said to each other, come, let us make bricks and make them thoroughly. And they used brick and stone and tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So calling it a tower that reaches to the heavens, by the way, wasn't a way of saying like it'll be really, really tall. Really tall. Okay, that's not what that means. Sure. It was a theological statement. Yeah. The Tower of Babel is regarded by all scholars, by the way, Christian and not Christian, okay, as one of Mesopotamia's famous sacred mountains. They were called ziggurats. Right. And ziggurats were divine abodes, places where Mesopotamians believed that heaven and earth met or intersected. And so the nature of the ziggurat is clear. It's to bring heaven down to earth. It's to bring the divine down to earth.
Hmm.
And so this was a place where human beings believed that they could mingle with the gods.
Hmm.
Now, but that's what Eden was. Eden was a place where heaven met earth. That's
Hmm.
why God dwelled there with his people and walked with them in the garden.
Right.
So Babel was an attempt to recreate Eden, to get back home on our own terms.
Hmm.
So there's nothing wrong with wanting to get back into the garden. Eventually we will one day. Amen. I think, like, that's why I said eternity is written on the heart of man, Lauren. Like, that's the desire that's built into our DNA.
Yeah.
But what they were trying to do is recreate paradise on their own terms apart from God. They
Hmm.
wanted utopia without salvation,
Hmm.
heaven without redemption, and a way back home without the Father.
Right.
And so ever since then, this is the important point. Ever since then, man has been trying to find a way to get back in.
Hmm.
And so if you come at the culture war with this perspective, Lauren, it will fundamentally change how Christians view what's called, the culture war or politics.
Right.
It's like, no,
Sure.
like, we're being driven by these fundamental, eternal, and theological longings.
Hmm.
And history is filled with examples of this, right? Socialism's promise of utopia is Babel by another name.
Yeah.
Collectivism and government control are the bricks that are used. But in every case, the goal is a better society, free from whatever the problem is, and a
Right.
paradise promised is always engineered apart from God. We see
Yeah.
that with Karl Marx. We see that with the Nazis. We see that with Herbert Marcuse, who I just quoted earlier, who said the way back into the garden is to take another bite of the fruit we were told not to eat. In other
Sure.
words, let's commit the original sin over and over and over again, and maybe eventually we'll find
Different
salvation
result.
without God. And
Sure.
so when you read the writings of the kooky sexual revolutionaries of the 20th century, you can't help but notice their use of religious precepts, terms, and concepts. Why? Because they can only do that.
Right.
Because they've been created by God. And as much as they try to liberate themselves beyond the need for salvation in a God, they're
Mhm.
longing for that nonetheless.
Right. Yeah. And I think it was Thomas Sowell that I read that had said the fundamental divide or difference between liberals and conservatives was whether or not you believe in the concept of original sin. And if you
Yeah.
believe that mankind are inherently good, then you think you can achieve utopia on your own terms. And that is what they are trying to do. They're trying to figure out ways to do that, except that they're starting from the concept of evolution and the idea that we come from monkeys. Then of course, if everything is survival of the fittest, it makes perfect sense that if
Yep.
you take that to its logical conclusion, it is going to lead to a lot of these kinds of movements. So can you then zoom in a little bit as far as connection between Margaret Sanger, Hitler, and the Nazis? Tell us what are the connections and why was it whitewashed up until very recently?
Well, yeah. I mean, listen, everyone knows that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist.
Hmm.
And by the way, what does eugenics mean?
Hmm.
Eugenics, the root word means good in birth.
Hmm.
Good in birth, which means what? Some people are not good in birth, not good in birth. So
Hmm.
there are qualities or genes, if you will, that are
Right.
desirable by
Right.
the elites, and there are qualities and genes that are not desirable, undesirables, and we
Sure.
don't. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to have kids. People forget because this stuff has been so buried and rewritten, right?
Hmm.
That Margaret Sanger called for sterilization and segregation camps for those that she considered human weeds. Here's what she said. Enforce a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted or whose inheritance is already such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring, end quote. All this stuff is in my book, by the way. It's only a 170-page book, but it has 230 citations or something if you want to prove all of these things. She
Yes.
called for sterilization and segregation camps for people that she believed had bad genes and shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. Don't let them have kids. Forcibly sterilize them. Hold them down and snip the man or tie her tubes, and don't let them have children. Margaret Sanger referred to herself as a eugenicist, Lauren. Okay, she was best friends with all the members of the American Eugenics Society.
Mhm.
She once said that birth control is not contraception
Mhm.
thoughtlessly and indiscriminately practiced. It means the cultivation and release of the better racial elements in our society and the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extinction of defective stocks, those human weeds, which threaten the blossoming of the finest flowers of American civilization, end quote.
Mhm.
So Margaret Sanger referred to herself as a eugenicist. She said, uh, birth control, eugenics without birth control seems to us a house built upon the sands. It is at the mercy of the rising streams of the unfit. The unfit, right. Every eugenicist believed that there were fit people and unfit people, and the unfit people should not be allowed to have kids. Okay, so now you're starting to see some of the similar ideologies that Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich had. By the way, Stalin, Mussolini, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot too. Let's name other genocidal maniacs from the 20th century. Okay, it's not like Hitler's the only one that I know how to refer to. However, there was shocking ties between the American eugenics movement and the policies and ideas that they were mainstreaming, and how it provided the inspiration and blueprint for the creation of the final solution in the Third Reich. This is well documented. I can prove this. Yes. But you have to do your research, and you have to often find like primary source books to find some of the stuff, because some of the books that expose a lot of these ties, they're hard to find today, and they're not in new print. There's been an agenda by the liberal establishment to really bury this stuff. It's not a forgotten history, Lauren. It's a hidden history. And so all of this came to really a crashing point in the summer of 2020. What happened in the summer of 2020, right after the mostly peaceful, somewhat fiery BLM arsonry riot protests because of George Floyd? Well, the left started to eat its own, because you know this about revolutions, right? They always eat their own. And so they started going after anything they thought was racist. You remember this because of the 1619 Project? Not my book, not the 1960
that was a
project,
great inversion.
but because of the 1619 Project, Lauren, that said America's systemically racist, root and branch, every institution's racist. That's why LeBron James says that when black people leave their home, they're being hunted, end quote. Yes, he did say that. And so anything that has vestiges of racism, like any institution or company, you know, whose roots, right, the beginning of that institution was racist, you can't redeem it. It's so bad and racist that the whole thing has to be burnt down. So defund the police, burn down courthouses and police stations in 2020, because they believe that the police force started in racism, and so it can't be redeemed. And then they said, we got to cancel Aunt Jemima. Remember the syrup lady? And so this led to this revolution eating its own, where the left, who is for abortion, Lauren, started attacking Planned Parenthood. And this was hilarious in 2020. These were not pro-lifers. These were pro-abortion BLM incorporated Marxists who attacked Planned Parenthood, a group that they usually support because they're all for abortions too. But they said, hey, Planned Parenthood, your founder, Margaret Sanger, she was a racist and a eugenicist. And the director of Planned Parenthood of Greater New York, Karen Seltzer, came out and said, yeah, she was. And she said she was a racist and she did damage to communities of color. And so we're taking her name off of our flagship Manhattan, New York City mega Planned Parenthood clinic in New York City called the Sanger Health Center. And New York City took the sign called the Sanger Square, the Margaret Sanger Square, off the sign that sat on the corner of the Planned Parenthood Sanger Health Center mega center Planned Parenthood clinic. So the city canceled Sanger, who's been called the patron saint of feminism. Never forget, Nancy Pelosi got the Margaret Sanger Award. I believe Barack Obama got the Margaret Sanger Award. Okay. And Kamala Harris has been trying really hard to get the Margaret Sanger Award, but they don't give it out anymore. Why? Because Planned Parenthood canceled their founder in the summer of 2020. And so they finally said, yes, she was a eugenicist. She was a really bad person. And you go, well, wait a second. You carried water for this woman for decades. You said she was the best thing since sliced bread. You said she was crushing through glass ceilings and helping poor minority families plan their parenthood, that she's one of the heroes of Western civilization in the 20th century. You named your buildings after her. You gave big Democrats an award in her name, while conservatives had been saying she was a racist and a eugenicist whose ideas and pals and friends and agenda helped inspire Hitler's Third Reich. We've been saying this for 100 years. You never listened to us. You called us conspiracy theorists and told us to take our tin hats off. But then because of George Floyd and BLM and the revolution eating its own and calling everything racist, you suddenly admit, because of pressure from the left and not the right, that she was a racist and a eugenicist.
I know.
So I think we have to go back. We have to understand what was the real story of Margaret Sanger, the history of Planned Parenthood and the sexual revolution that they ignored for 100 years before, boom, in the summer of 2020, canceling her and acknowledging that that history was bad enough to make Margaret Sanger cancel-worthy. And so to answer your question about the Nazi stuff and the links between Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, let me just give one vignette from the book to really make your audience's jaws drop. Okay. There was a founding board member By the way, my book is called The 1916 Project: The Lying, the Witch, and the War We're In.
I
The
love
Lying,
that.
the Witch, and the War We're In. Okay? It's
Uh-huh.
all the lies that created our culture, the witch who mainstreamed them better than anyone else in the 20th century, and the war that's been created. So buckle up, it's more dangerous than you thought.
Yeah.
And the movie is a 75-minute full-length documentary called The 1916 Project. But the founding board member of Planned Parenthood,
Mhm.
founding board member when the organization was founded in 1921. So she opens her first clinic in 1916. That was really the beginning. But
Right.
1921 was the formal, the formalizing of the
It was
organization
legal.
called the
Yeah.
American Birth Control League,
Hmm.
later renamed.
Uh-huh.
Later renamed Planned
Yeah.
Parenthood. By the way, Lauren, they renamed it to Planned Parenthood in 1942. Oh, what an interesting date to rename your organization. Why? Because everyone knew that she was so involved in the eugenics movement in the 20s and the 30s, and that her board members, financiers, pals, friends, and guest writers for her magazine were read by Hitler, were read by his lackeys. We know that Hitler studied the laws in American states on
Right.
sterilization laws of those considered unfit to reproduce. She was so involved in the eugenics movement that it was so scandalous for the PR of Planned Parenthood. So in 1942, after Hitler gave the phrase eugenics a little bit of a negative connotation, Margaret Sanger changed the name of her organization from the American Birth Control League to Planned Parenthood to move away from her association with the eugenics movement. Just so you know why that was the date that she changed the name of her
Interesting.
organization. Anyways, this founding board member, Lothrop Stoddard, kind of a weird name.
That is.
I have the documentation. I have the list that showed the first board members in 1921 when the organization was established. Sure enough, there's his name. Well, who was this guy? Well, he was the Grand Wizard of the Massachusetts KKK. All right, let's let your audience breathe for a second. Okay, what did I just say? He was the Grand Wizard of the Massachusetts Ku Klux Klan. Yes, white hoods, folks. The KKK. All right? Now, you might be thinking, Massachusetts? There was a KKK in yes, there was a KKK in Massachusetts, and Lothrop Stoddard was their Grand Wizard.
Uh-huh.
His writings on racism were incredibly influential in the development of the organization known as the KKK. Lothrop Stoddard held that position for years. That board member of Planned Parenthood, he held that position for years. He wrote a couple books. Well, he wrote several books, but the more shocking ones. One of them was called "The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy."
Okay.
And you
Wow.
go, wait a second. So Seth, tell me that Margaret Sanger, after this point, kicked him off the board of directors, right? Because I was told by the New York Times and Washington Post that Margaret Sanger was a woman of her time, that she knew some bad racists and eugenicists, but she herself wasn't a racist. So surely he was kicked off the board. No. He held that position for years. He wrote another book called The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman. The Menace of the Underman. And so you go, okay, so who's the underman, Seth?
Yeah.
Who's the
Right.
underman? Well, for Stoddard, Lauren, it would have been blacks, Slavs, Italians, Jews, and the mentally and physically disabled. And so they're a menace. Like, yes, mom who listening to this, like Dennis the Menace. Yes, like a menace. They're a menace, and it's the menace of the underman. So the underman is the menace, and they're harming the creation of the Ubermenschen. That would be the superhuman, the super race, the perfected race that all the eugenicists believe that they could create
Yeah.
if they could just control the scientific institutions, right? Follow the science.
Mhm.
That's right. 100 years ago, following the science meant being a eugenicist. It's very important for your audience to understand this, Lauren. Eugenics did not have the nasty negative connotation that Hitler would later give it.
Okay.
In the 19-teens and the early 1920s and the early 1930s, eugenics was considered as just the natural progressive revolution of perfecting humankind.
Well, and
The Museum of Natural History,
sure.
our Supreme Court, Harvard had a eugenics chair. So many people were on board with eugenics. It was considered following the science.
Well, and if
And
you
so,
take
go
evolution
ahead.
to its logical conclusion, that's absolutely what it would lead to if you.
Well, guess what? That connection doesn't just happen philosophically, as you so
Right.
aptly pointed out, Lauren. That connection happened within the same family. So Charles Darwin, who wrote The Origin of Species, right, and says,
Yeah.
what does he say? He says, survival of the
Fittest.
fittest. Survival of the fittest. And it's an animal kingdom. We came from monkeys, right? Says Darwin. So therefore, the strong will survive and the weak will die.
Mhm.
Right? Isn't that what happens in an animal kingdom?
Of course.
It's literally survival of the fittest. That's what happens
Yeah.
with animals in forests.
Right.
So we're like animals, and so the fittest will survive. Well, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, read his cousin's book, Origin of Species, and said that it changed his life. He said it was the most influential book on his life. Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, created a term. He coined a term. He invented a word: eugenics.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, is the modern father of the eugenics movement and coined the freaking term. He believed that in order to secure his cousin's survival of the fittest,
Right.
the way you had to do that was by the elimination of the unfit. So might makes right in the religion of Darwinism and eugenics. So that apple falling from that tree didn't fall far. We went from survival of the fittest Darwinism to eliminate the unfit through eugenics within the same family, their cousins. So that's where we get eugenics, is from Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin.
Yeah.
Francis Galton would then mentor a man named Havelock Ellis. And if you read my book recently, you remember this name. Havelock Ellis was the Alfred Kinsey of England. He was a kooky sexual theorist weirdo. He wrote over 100 books on every weird form of sexual experimentation. Havelock Ellis was himself impotent. That's the PG-13 version. So he was always trying to find new ways to get excited. He would host orgies in his home. He would make his wife watch him while he participated in these entanglements with both men and women. And he forced his wife into lesbianism. And guess who Havelock Ellis began a raging affair with when a young woman came to England for 18 months to avoid being arrested by New York authorities for breaking the obscenity laws and the Comstock laws? Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger had to flee New York in 1914 because of lewd. Actually, I actually have the pamphlet that was going to get her arrested. It cost about $500. Would you like to see it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so this is pretty shocking. This is the little pamphlet that she had her husband spread across the country. It's called Family Limitation by Margaret Sanger.
Wow.
And in this little booklet, she recommends illegal, unsafe, like douches and chemicals and various ways to not have kids. It was this and her magazine Woman Rebel, which bore the headline "No Gods and No Masters," that was going to get her arrested for breaking the obscenity laws in New York City. And so she flees to England and she begins an affair with Havelock Ellis, who was discipled and mentored by Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics and is the father of the modern eugenics movement, who was discipled by his cousin Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin, who read the writings of Thomas Malthus in the late 1700s, and he was the first person who believed there were too many people on planet Earth. So we went from the first overpopulation theorist. Darwin read Malthus's writings, and it's what drove his study on the beagle, who then writes Origin of Species, who then influences his cousin, who coins the term eugenics, who then mentors Havelock Ellis, the Alfred Kinsey of England, who then becomes the #1 political and sexual mentor to a young woman named Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, one of the largest, best funded, and most profitable 501c3 organizations in human history, the largest abortion provider in the world, the largest provider of the pornographic comprehensive sexuality education in America's public schools that has a lot of angry moms and dads speaking at school board meetings. And as of last year, Planned Parenthood is the second largest provider of chemically castrating transgender drugs for America's gender-confused youth. Planned Parenthood's fastest growing revenue stream, Lauren, is now trans drugs for teens. That's one organization from one woman who was discipled in a long train of disciples and revolutionaries on the left that we can trace back to the first overpopulationist who believed there were too many people on planet Earth, Thomas Malthus, when America is only about 20 years old in the late 1700s. What am I talking about? It's the Great Commission flipped upside down. They
Yes.
have done better to disciple and raise up a generation of leaders on the left who want to tear down Christendom and replace it with something fresh and new. This is the
Mhm.
Marxist walk through the institutions, that we need to take over every institution, but really we need to change the culture. Because if you want to change the culture, you've got to approach it culturally. And that's why Sanger's revolution began in Greenwich Village in New York City, the most culturally formative city in the world. Now, this founding board member, Lothrop Stoddard, then called himself a eugenicist. He was part of the American Eugenics Society. He would later be a member of the American Eugenics Society.
Mhm.
And guess who wrote the review of his book, The Menace of the Underman, in Margaret Sanger's magazine, The Birth Control Review? Havelock Ellis, the one that Sanger was shacking up with in England. And he coached Sanger's journey back to New York, saying, you're too intense. Stop talking about communism and anarchism. To talk more about birth control and eugenics, because that's more scientifically acceptable. He coached her to tone down her rhetoric to be more effective. And Sanger believes that this was the most revolutionary, impactful person on her life. So of course it makes sense that she would begin putting people on her board of directors who believe the same things as her mentor, Havelock Ellis, who called himself a eugenicist, who was mentored by the guy who coined the freaking term eugenics. All of this goes together. And so I'll finish with this in terms of the Nazi stuff, because we could spend an hour on this actually. But Lothrop Stoddard hit that book, The Menace of the Underman, that I was telling you about. It was translated into German by the Nazis. I actually have the German edition. Actually, I'll pull that out for your listeners
Yeah.
too.
Wow.
So there was one of these available online, available in the entire world. It cost me about $350. There was only one available. I bought it a few months ago. It shipped from Europe. It took me about 6 weeks to get it. So there's his name, Lothrop Stoddard.
Yeah.
Once again, the founding board member of Planned Parenthood. Doesn't he look like a demon?
He does.
And this book was translated into German in 1925. You'll notice none of this is legible. It's all in old German.
Sure.
And what is that underman? What does that last word look like there? Underman. It says Untermenschen. Untermenschen. Right. I've heard that phrase before. Untermensch. It's the title of Heinrich Himmler's famous Nazi propaganda book. Der Untermensch. Untermensch would later kind of be translated into English as subhuman. Untermensch, referred to those that they exterminated. In no small part, the Jews.
Right.
And so historians did not begin to see the phrase Untermensch begin to be used by the Nazis until this book. They got the phrase subhuman, they got the phrase Untermensch from the German translated version of Margaret Sanger's guest writer, advisor, financier, and first board member of Planned Parenthood, who was the Grand Wizard of the Massachusetts KKK. Now, Stoddard's books began to be featured in Nazi school textbooks, and he was so well beloved by the Nazis, Lauren, that he was invited to the Third Reich in 1939. Now, I believe at this point he was still on the board of Planned Parenthood. And in 1939, he travels to Germany upon invitation by the Third Reich. Let me make sure I make that clear. And he did a free-range journalistic interview tour. He interviewed Heinrich Himmler. He interviewed Joseph Goebbels, or Goebbels, depending how you want to say it. He interviewed Fritz Sauckel and Robert Ley. And he had a brief meeting with, I guess you can't guess who, Adolf Hitler. He's the only American we know of. Let me say this again. The founding board member of Planned Parenthood is the only American we know of who had a one-on-one meeting with Adolf Hitler after he rose to power. So not only did the Nazis get the phrase subhuman from Margaret Sanger's first founding board member, they invited him to the Third Reich. He helped influence a eugenics court to reach a decision on forced sterilizations, which, by the way, makes sense as well, because in 1927, our Supreme Court in America passed the Supreme Court decision Buck versus Bell, which was an 8-1 decision that upheld a Virginia law which required the mandated forced sterilization of those considered a threat to the gene pool. So people aren't aware of this decision. Why? Because it's been hidden from you in your children's education in public schools, by the way, which is why if you're listening to this and you're a homeschool mom, I tell you, good job. I was homeschooled as well. This decision, Buck versus Bell, in an 8-1 decision, 8-1, 8 Supreme Court justices said, yes, the state of Virginia and therefore all of the country should be allowed to decide which moms and which dads, which males and which females should be allowed to reproduce. And if in the view of the scientific establishment, it's determined that this man and woman should not be allowed to have children, we can forcibly tie their ankles and their arms down on a table and forcibly sterilize them so they will never have children. In the next 10 years, it's believed that over 70,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized between California and New York in the land of the free and the home of the brave. How influential was Buck versus Bell in 1927? Well, not only did Margaret Sanger celebrate and endorse the Supreme Court decision when it was decided in 1927, later, after we defeated the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, that's right, the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis cited our Supreme Court decision, Buck versus Bell, in their defense at the Nuremberg trials, as if to say, who are you to judge us, America? You were doing eugenics and forced sterilization first. So Sanger celebrated that decision. So of course, Lothrop Stoddard, the founding board member of Planned Parenthood, is helping influence a eugenics court in the Third Reich in their forced sterilization legislation, which they had copycatted the blueprint from American legislation. Hitler openly acknowledged that he got his ideas for race-based and eugenics-based sterilization laws from American states. It wasn't his original idea. These are the kinds of things that have been hidden from us. Wow. So Lothrop Stoddard returns to America, and he writes about his journey interviewing Nazis in the Third Reich in a book published in 1940 called Into the Darkness, Nazi Germany Today. And Hitler wouldn't allow him to publish the transcript of his interview with the Fuhrer. But Hitler later sent him a letter of the two of them taken together. And he describes in like, it's hard not to blush reading Lothrop Stoddard's drooling praise of Adolf Hitler. Once again, that's one of Margaret Sanger's best friends. So we've only scratched the surface on the kind of things that have been hidden from us, but this is why Planned Parenthood is a more successful genocidal organization than Hitler could have ever hoped to be in his dizziest daydreams. Planned Parenthood performs 33% of the nation's abortions every year. So about a third of the babies killed every year are killed by one organization, Planned Parenthood. They've probably killed over 25 million babies, that organization alone, since 1970, when California had and New York actually had legalized abortion even before Roe versus Wade. They make Hitler look like a toddler playing in a sandbox.
Oh my goodness, that is so crazy. So given all of this foundation, I think almost anybody who's listening, who is a believer and who thinks that we should stay out of politics would say, okay, this is just straight up evil. But what would you say to people who say there should be a separation between our religious beliefs and what we're doing in politics, or that we should stay out of it?
It's a myth and it never existed.
Okay.
We're living in a theocracy right now, Lauren. It's the theocracy of the religion of humanism. Someone's religion and someone's morality and someone's worldview will be the dominant one in charge. I hope if you're listening to this, you recognize how true what I'm about to say is. Have you understood now that there's no such thing as moral neutrality? I hope you see that now from 2020 and 2021.
Right.
When Christians disengaged and had been for some time, what happened? Well, strip clubs, abortion mills, and weed dispensaries were labeled essential services. But you couldn't go to church, of course, because then you're a granny killer and a super spreader. If you go to church and you meet in your congregation, your sanctuary at 50% capacity, of course, Fauci and Rick Warren and Christianity Today and the Gospel Coalition all say you're a granny killer and a super spreader and you're in violation of the second greatest commandment to love your neighbor. But wait a second, but I can go get an abortion, I can shop at Walmart, and I can get a lap dance. And our Democrat political betters labeled those essential services. You guys got to remember this from 2020. Those were essential services. But you want to worship the King of Kings and Lord of Lords on a Sunday morning? Well, that's super dangerous, obviously, because don't you know COVID is only dangerous when the germs come off the lips of a conservative or Christian. But when they come off the lips If it comes out the lips of a BLM Antifa activist burning down Minneapolis, St. Paul in the summer of 2020, then Fauci and the entire liberal establishment, who just got done saying that Christians are granny killers and super spreaders, suddenly have nothing to say about other mass gatherings of people who are with them politically. Are you telling me that COVID can differentiate between secular liberals and conservative Christians? Come on, don't urinate on my leg and tell me it's raining. But what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that it was always theological. Humanism, Darwinism are fundamentally religious doctrines.
Yeah.
Now, why? Because paganism is religious, actually. Now, I'm not talking about pure and undefiled religion, obviously. I'm not talking about Christianity, but it's religious and it functions like a religion. And we have to treat it as such because man is fundamentally a religious being. So what did Lyndon Baines Johnson say? He said the separation of church and state. This is where we get the Johnson Amendment. And I meet so many Christians who believe this. They say there's a separation of church and state. We shouldn't be enforcing our Christian beliefs onto the public square. Well, that's true to a certain extent, meaning I'm not going to walk around with a pistol and say, repent and believe for the kingdom of God is at hand. And if they don't become a Christian, I shoot them. Of course not. That's stupid and asinine. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that there is a moral code. There's still a moral law. And someone's moral law and someone's morality is going to actually be the one in charge. So when we abdicate, and when we pull out of the political and cultural process because we've listened to too many, Rick Warren sermons, and we're like, well, just preach the gospel. Well, what ends up happening? We go right back to demon worship. Actually, is what happened. Is that the secularists and the materialists and the humanists, they pick up the reins of power that we were too pious and self-righteous to use. R.J. Rushdoony, the father of the modern homeschool movement, said, dominion does not disappear when a man renounces it. It is simply transferred to another party, perhaps to his wife, children, employer, or the state, where the individual surrenders his due dominion, where the family abdicates it and the worker and employer reduce it. There another party, usually the state, concentrates dominion. He said, where organized society surrenders power, the mob gains it, proportionate to the surrender. What he meant was that to the same percentage and degree that you release the reins of political power, that you abdicate, that you say, I'm not political, I just preach the gospel. It is to that same percentage point and degree that the mob and the secular progressives will pick up the reins of power that Christians were too pious and self-righteous to use because we like navel gazing as the world burns. And they will use those reins of power to accomplish for wickedness what God's people are no longer willing to accomplish for righteousness. And we will owe an explanation to the next generation if things really go south in this republic, which it feels like we're in a season of the last stand, as they're sexually mutilating children. CPS has kidnapped some kids from their parents' homes because the public health, I can tell that story, by the way. The public health scientists determined that one of the non-gender affirming parents was a mental health risk to the minor who wanted to be called by an opposite sex name and pronouns. And so they took the kid away from the home. And that's now legal in the state of California, Washington, Minnesota, and you're going to see it continue to spread across the country. And remember, who's the second largest provider of cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers? Planned Parenthood. So even if you're listening to this and you're like, Lauren, I don't really like this guest, I'm not listening to your podcast anymore because I think that there should be some restrictions on abortion, but it shouldn't be banned. And I'm sort of a moderate, and I don't really like this guy. Well, I bet that I bet that you listening to this right now don't like that we're sexually mutilating and castrating minors, and that we can show them pornographic cartoons in public high schools through the school library and the sex ed health curriculum. I bet even if you think some abortions are okay, you don't like that stuff. I'm here today to tell you, if you're listening to this, guess who also profits off of the sexualization of children in the public schools and the trans drugs for teens? Planned Parenthood, same organization. So if you're listening to this and you don't like me, maybe you should humbly ask yourself, am I missing something? Is there some connective tissue that sort of connects these various worldview issues and cultural issues together? And maybe there's a paganism, or maybe there's like an underlying worldview that animates the culture of death and its various tentacles of the Leviathan. And maybe Seth is onto something, and I need to think more deeply about the things I'm supporting. I would say yes, there's a reason why Planned Parenthood is involved in so many of these things. For them, sex ed is their sales funnel, abortion is their product, and your children are their prospects. It's a sales funnel.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit behind why we need to care about this and why it's not political.
Sure.
These are theological, biblical issues.
Yeah.
So much so that God didn't enter human history as a 30-year-old man. He entered human history in a process he really reveres:
Uh-huh.
conception, gestation, birth. Jesus enters human history as a fetus to redeem mankind from their sins. That's
Mhm.
why Elizabeth is filled with the Holy Spirit when the prenatal John the Baptist starts doing backflips in the uterus,
Mhm.
recognizing the
Mhm.
humanity and divinity of his prenatal deity, fetal Christ, second member of the Trinity, unborn God Savior, who was knitting himself together in the womb while he was knitting John the Baptist together in the womb, because
Yeah.
that is God in the womb, because Jesus is not fully God and fully human from the moment of birth.
Right.
Jesus is fully God and fully human from the moment of conception. Follow the
Right.
science. So that is the second member of the Trinity and the creator of the universe in Mary's womb.
Yeah.
That's the incarnation. That's the gospel. I'm
Yeah.
not even telling you go vote for Trump. What I'm telling you is to care as deeply about these issues as your Lord does. We are under judgment in America in no small part because of the 70 million children who have been slaughtered in the name of radical feminism since 1970 in America. And it's about time, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, that Christians in the church wake up and see how demonic all of this is. I could
Mhm.
talk about that for a long time. But what my point is that we've let the other side define the terms of engagement.
Yeah.
They've defined a fundamentally demonic, biblical, and spiritual issue, killing babies and child sacrifice,
Yeah.
as just the science and just the politics to
Right.
keep the politically impotent pastors silent.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And as you were talking, the analogy that popped into my head is infections. Opportunistic infections occur when you wipe out the good flora, the good bacteria. And then the opportunists who would have
That's
been
right.
kind of like sequestered in the background suddenly begin to take advantage, and they proliferate in that free space because they've got a wide open playing field, and they absolutely can. So it's the same principle, just play it out on a different stage. Yeah.
Very good. Well
So
said.
so the White Rose Resistance, give us a little bit of why you picked that name and why that inspires you.
Yeah, most people don't know the story of the White Rose Resistance.
Yeah.
I tell the story in the second to last chapter of my book, but the White Rose Resistance was an anti-Nazi Christian youth movement
Mhm.
in 1942 and the beginning of 1943. And they were all kids in their 20s, which was one of the most fascinating things about it. There was one professor who was older, but the rest of the kids were in their 20s.
Mhm.
And some of them were students at the University of Munich.
Mhm.
Now, these students and members of the White Rose are national heroes in Germany today. Even though we may not know their names as well in America, it's important to point out that they have streets and buildings and schools named after them in Germany.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're heralded as heroes of people who are just doing the right thing,
Right.
no matter what the consequences. And so what they would do is they would stay up late writing and printing these anti-Nazi illegal leaflets,
Mhm.
exposing the crimes of the Nazis, calling them out, and asking good people to wake up. They would say things like, "If you know, why do you not act?"
Mhm.
They said things like, "We are the White Rose Resistance. We are your bad conscience, and we will not leave you alone." They would spray paint graffiti on Nazi-owned buildings the phrase "Down with Hitler." So they were pretty baller.
Yeah.
And one day in 1942, remember the same year that Margaret Sanger changed the name of her organization to the name Planned Parenthood.
Right.
That same year, a young 21-year-old named Sophie Scholl was walking the sidewalks of Munich, Germany. She was a student at the University of Munich. She was a Christian. She had dreams of becoming a school teacher. Her dad had actually spent some time in prison for publicly criticizing Hitler. So she already came from a good family and
Wow.
heritage of Christian resistance. And she found a paper, a leaflet on
Yeah.
the ground on the sidewalk, and it said "Leaflets of the White Rose."
Wow.
And so she took out this leaflet, Lauren, and sure enough, it was publicly condemning the crimes of the Nazis and asking people to wake up.
Mhm.
And her heart was stirred to action. She wanted to join whatever the White Rose Resistance was. But we know from stories of her sister and her family that at that time, what she was thinking was, "This sounds a lot like my brother Hans. He talks like dinner. He talks like this at dinner all the time. Why does this sound like one of my brother's rants?" Well, sure enough, the White Rose Resistance had not only been co-founded, but it was being run by none other than her older brother Hans,
Oh,
a
wow.
24-year-old young man who was just trying to protect his little sister. You see, he knew how dangerous political resistance would have been to the Third Reich that far into the war in
Wow.
1942. But
Right.
Sophie demanded to join the White Rose Resistance, and she became the only female and the youngest member of the
Mm.
White Rose Resistance at 21 years old. For the rest of 1942, they would stay up late writing, printing, and taking trains in the middle of the night to distribute these anti-Nazi leaflets and awaken the church, to prick the conscience of the culture, to
Mhm.
ask them to do something and to act and to participate in actions of resistance to try to bring this to a grinding halt.
Yeah.
And in 1943, they took things to the next level. Um, and on February 18th, 1943, so 81 years ago,
Mhm.
they walked onto the campus at the University of Munich, where we filmed at for my movie and documentary, Lauren, the 1916 Project. And I'll tell you guys how to watch that in just 1 second. But
Yeah.
and the classes were in session, and so they were walking the halls where I stood this last December, and they were dropping off illegal leaflets outside of the classrooms and throughout the university. And in this iconic scene, as the bell rings and class is dismissed, Sophie runs 3 stories up on stairs I just walked to the third floor balcony of the University of Munich, and she throws the remaining 100 leaflets she had with her 3 stories down to the atrium below in an act of defiance.
Uh-huh.
As the students are released, the janitor catches Sophie in the act, called the Gestapo on the spot, and Hans and Sophie were immediately arrested on February 18th, 1943. They spent 4 days in prison being brutally abused and physically interrogated. One of their interrogations lasted, I think, 10 hours. And they refused to implicate or rat out any of their other friends or members of the White Rose, Lauren. Unfortunately, they found incriminating evidence in Hans's pocket of a leaflet he had tried to eat and swallow. And they could tell that it was matched the handwriting of a man that they had been tracking. His name was Christoph Probst, who was a friend of theirs. And they did not want Christoph Probst with them on that day at the university because his wife was in the hospital recovering from childbirth for
Mhm.
a daughter he would never meet. Hours later, they arrested Christoph Probst, and with him and the 2 Scholl siblings, they were brutally abused and interrogated. They eventually owned up to what they did, but they refused to rat out any of their friends. Sophie said she would do it all over again. And she told the Nazi interrogating her, she said, "I'm not wrong. You have the wrong worldview."
Mhm.
4 days later, they had their heads chopped off on a guillotine on a chopping block. And in those 4 days in prison, I believe that our father met Hans and Sophie in their prison cell. But Sophie in particular, because of her beauty, her grace, and her innocence, um, her moral clarity, her political clarity, her spiritual clarity, the things she said, unreal. It transcended almost any of the prophetic clarity of the pulpits of Germany and the pastors of the land at that time. The prison guards were so disturbed by Hans and Sophie's bravery in the face of death that they relaxed the rules and let Hans and Sophie meet with their parents in a side room
Mhm.
minutes before they had their heads chopped off. And Sophie's mother looked her doomed daughter in the eyes and said, "Remember Jesus, Sophie." And Sophie said, "Yes, but you too, Mama. You too." Her cellmate, Elsie Goebbels, survived the Holocaust and the war. And months later, she wrote letters to Sophie's parents because she had spent every final minute of Sophie's life with her in that prison cell. And she told Sophie's parents, she said, "Your daughter was not so disturbed by her impending death. She was disturbed in soul as to how her parents could handle losing 2 children on the same day."
Yeah.
That's where this 21-year-old's heart and head was at right before she was killed.
Oh my God.
According to her cellmate, as she was about to be escorted out of her cell room to the chopping block, Sophie looked out the window with bars on it, and she said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there's hardly anyone willing, able to give themselves up to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go now. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?"
Wow.
But they weren't, and nobody listened, and Hitler's maniacal genocidal Holocaust continued for another 2.5 years. Sophie according to the executioner, the guy who chopped her head off, he was later interviewed. And he said Sophie's final words were, "The sun still shines." And Hans's final words, like William Wallace from Braveheart, was "Freedom! Freedom." And that was the end of Hans and Sophie Scholl and the end of the White Rose Resistance. And for the next few months, they rounded up all of the other members of the White Rose Resistance and murdered them as well.
Oh my gosh.
So we say, while rose blossoms may perish in the fall, they reappear in the spring.
Yeah.
And while all of the members of the White Rose were found and executed, Lauren, their sacrifice planted the good seeds of resistance in the hearts of millions, whose actions will keep alive the legacy of the White Rose. And your sacrifice, church, will water those seeds of resistance, so that one day, maybe, thousands will be awakened and stirred to action. The White Rose will blossom again, and we can say, like Sophie, the sun still shines, spelled S-O-N. The last interesting part of that story is they had a meeting set up with a man on February 22nd, on February 26th, 4 days later. They were supposed to meet with someone 4 days later to build Christian resistance in Germany and mobilize and awaken the church.
Yeah.
Well, that man was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the founder of the Confessing Church in Nazi Germany, who was killed, hung naked at Flossenburg prison for his role in the Valkyrie plot. Ever seen the movie Valkyrie? The attempt to assassinate Hitler. He was hung naked for his role in the failed assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. My good friend, Eric Metaxas, who's endorsed this book, my book, wrote a best-selling biography on Bonhoeffer in 2010. Yeah, called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. And it's a new movie coming out shortly by Angel Studios. Bonhoeffer is one of the heroes of the 20th century. He had come to meet with Hans and Sophie of the White Rose Resistance, but he attended an empty coffee shop, for they had been killed and beheaded 4 days earlier. So that's the story of the White Rose Resistance. Why did I pick that name? Because if you've listened to anything for the last 50 minutes, you understand that we're facing the same ideology and worldview today. Eugenics, materialism, secularism, wokeism. Eat the apple, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then you'll really see reality, and ye shall be as gods. And when we take the place of God, we can live however the hell we want. And if it means obliterating and eliminating millions of people on the altar of self, on the altar of orgasms without responsibility, on the altar of whatever gods we've erected for ourselves to fill the God-shaped hole in our heart, then there's no limits to the evil that man is capable of. Those who murder the unborn cannot be trusted to govern the born. And those who murder the unborn will one day murder you too, the longer you tolerate the sacrament of Satan. And if you think I'm joking, if you think I'm jesting, when Roe v. Wade was overturned on June 24th, 2022, in the next 2 months, pro-abortion domestic terrorists burned down, physically defaced, and firebombed over 100 pro-life ministries in America. Now, what happens when someone who calls themselves pro-life bombs an abortion clinic, which there's been a few incidents of over the last few decades? It's plastering every headline of the legacy news media. It's all they can talk about. And they say, and then what do they try to do? They say, this represents all pro-lifers. That's what they do. They bomb people. It's like, well, first of all, get off your moral high horse, you freaking eugenicist demoniac. You support murdering innocent babies. I'm not condoning bombing abortion clinics, but you have no place in which to lecture and pontificate about morality and killing innocents. Spare me. But what's my point? They burned down, firebomb, and deface over 100 pro-life ministries, and it's basically silence from the legacy news media. They began attacking pro-lifers. And guess what they were spray painting on the walls and buildings of dozens of pro-life ministries around the country? In the 2 months following the overturning of Roe versus Wade, they were spray painting the words, if abortions aren't safe, then you aren't either. Now, Merrick Garland, hey, Department of Homeland Security, that sounds like a domestic terrorist threat. Of course, how many of those people have been actually arrested or apprehended? Zero. But don't worry, our FBI opened up an investigation into what they call domestic terrorism of parents speaking at school board meetings because they were getting a little bit carried away in their rhetoric and maybe cursing a little bit because they were upset about the pornographic sex ed that, by the way, is mainstreamed and sold by no one larger than Planned Parenthood in the public schools that was getting them so angry. So if you get carried away rhetorically, you're a domestic terrorist. But burn down a pro-life organization because you're angry that Roe got overturned, nothing's happening. A few weeks ago, they just threw a mom into federal prison for 41 months for sidewalk counseling outside of an abortion center and pleading with the life of mothers who want to kill their kids to not kill their kids and promising to rally around that mom and help her and champion her in the motherhood to the child she's already a mother to. That pro-life sidewalk counselor just got 41 months in federal prison. Now, hopefully it'll get legislated down or argued down, but what did they just do? They threw a mom in federal prison, not for trespassing an abortion clinic. Let me be clear about this case I'm referring to. She did not trespass inside the abortion center, although I think that's morally justified, although it may be illegal because there's a difference between legality and morality. Okay. She didn't even chain herself to the door. It's not like she was blocking, like, duct taped herself to the door so you couldn't get in. Yeah. She didn't do any of that. And she's getting 41 months in federal prison for allegedly violating the FACE Act, which is the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances. And it's what they came up with during Operation Rescue in the 80s for the people who were actually participating in civil disobedience by linking their arms and laying down and blocking the access to abortion centers, which, by the way, is beautiful, and a lot of babies were saved. But this mom didn't even break the law. And there's about 20 others who are looking at time in federal prison because they want to protect the unborn. Yes, so I just proved it to you. Those who murder the unborn cannot be trusted to govern the born, and those who murder the unborn will one day come for you too. Right. We're dealing with the question of who counts as one of us. Who counts as one of us? Who's a person, really? Who gets to have rights? And so when Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, what did they say? They said being human is not enough to have human rights. Because every secular bioethicist, Lauren, agrees that human life begins at conception and that the preborn child is human. They are a member of the species Homo sapiens. They are a human being. But they say they don't have human rights because they're not a person yet. So it's very important for you to understand that in 1973, the Supreme Court said being human is no longer enough to have human rights. Well, then who counts as one of us? And what grounds are human rights? Where do they come from? Because this is very interesting. If abortion is a positive right, that means a legal right, then the abortion advocate cannot really complain if the state does not permit her an abortion. For the same government that can grant rights can take them away. But if abortion is a natural right, a human right, a right that springs from our human nature, then the abortion advocate had that right from the moment they began to exist, the moment of conception. So as Hadley Arkes says, we are left with an amusing paradox. According to the logic of abortion advocates, unborn women do not have a right to life, but they do have the right to an abortion.
Wow.
Yeah, your head should be spinning right now because none of this stuff makes sense. Sure. Our rights come from the fact that we're human beings. We became a human being at the moment of conception. Now, I believe our rights come from God, and so did our founding fathers. That's right. Governments are instituted among men to recognize and protect these God-given rights that were endowed with these inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that they come from our Creator. That's who's endowing us with these rights. But if you can liberate yourself, even from the constraints of human nature itself, and say there is no creator, there is no lawgiver. Man is God. No gods and no masters, wrote Margaret Sanger. Then why would you, Christian listening to this, why would you presume that they would stop at the unborn? They won't. And by the way, neither did the Nazis. The Nazis didn't start with a wholesale slaughter of Jews. You see, tyranny happens incrementally and then suddenly. It happens slowly enough, like the frog in the boiling water, that by the time you recognize it, it's too late. Okay, we are almost at a Rubicon line in the culture war, and I'm here to simply suggest that one, maybe it began with our tolerance of child killing as a litmus test for the church in the country, and maybe if we can go back to 1916 and understand how this revolution began and the theological religious warfare that was raging around these ideas and principles, maybe we can reverse engineer the sexual revolution, and maybe the church will wake up and reclaim their spiritual prophetic mantle and heritage of Christian resistance, because I don't think the politicians are coming to save us anytime soon, Lauren. I think it will be the people of God being the people of God in the local area where God has put them to bring an end to these evils, which is why our book and film is not just an educational tool, it's building a movement. And we're now launching resistance chapters all around the country. Boise, Idaho, Southern California, Fort Worth, Florida, and Denver this fall, of mobilizing regional leadership to train, and I have a whole team to train and activate Christians to go out there and do the kind of activities in the culture where you live that will make a difference and bring a grinding halt to this demonic, anti-God, baby-killing, destroy the family agenda, which will one day come to your front door.
Mhm.
The longer that you tolerate this evil.
So give our listeners their marching orders. So if they want to get involved, they want to see the documentary, they want to pick up the book, they want to do something, what do they do?
Go to the1916project.com, the1916project.com,
Uh-huh.
and this 75-minute full-length documentary, which is much easier to watch than it is to read a book, obviously, because watching movies is easier,
Yeah.
is screening exclusively in the churches of America right now. So
Okay.
any church or leadership or pastor can go to the1916project.com, or you can go tell your pastor to do it, and
Mhm.
press the button host a screening, and you fill out a form and my team gets in touch with you. We have hundreds of churches screening this film in America right now. We've actually done some in Ireland, Canada, New Zealand,
Wow.
Australia, and South America, and we're working on international translations right now as well, Lauren,
Fabulous.
and translations for the book, especially for Hispanics who have conservative values but
Right.
often vote for Democrats because they don't understand the agenda. So we're
Sure.
working a lot to reach the people of America and especially the church. It will come out later this year, the movie, for the
Mhm.
whole world to watch. But right now, it's screening exclusively in churches. And you can press view a screening or attend a screening if you want to see our screening schedule. The
Mhm.
book you can pre order at our website, the1916project.com.
Mhm.
Or Amazon. You can pre-order it on Amazon,
Mhm.
but get it from us and support a pro-life ministry and not Christian-hating, baby-hating Amazon. If you pre-order the hardcover copy, which comes out September 4th, so very soon,
Mhm.
it comes with a fold-out timeline of all the significant dates, events, and people who architected this insane culture of death we're living in today. All the dirty little secrets that you learn about in the book are represented
Mhm.
in this cool timeline, especially for homeschool moms and
Nice.
families,
Yeah.
which folds up into a little sleeve in the book. And later this year, we're coming out with a study guide and multi-episode curriculum as a companion to the 1916 Project, which has all of the interviews and all of the teaching that we filmed that couldn't make it into the documentary because it would have been too long,
Wow.
for Christian schools, homeschoolers, co-ops, Bible studies, and small groups in churches. So there's a lot we're doing for the church to equip them. But the important thing is we're building this movement in film as an international movement to launch resistance chapters to
Right.
train and mobilize the church, resulting in something we're doing next June of 2025 called The Last Stand.
Mm.
And you can go to thelaststand.com to learn about this. The Last Stand. We're in a season of The Last Stand, Lauren, whether America will remain free, whether we will have life and liberty, or descend back into a despotic regime that
Mhm.
wipes out the church first. So
Mhm.
The Last Stand will be a 10,000 person event in Southern California with some of the biggest speakers and artists. It will be worship, national repentance, and mobilization and sending. This is the few things we're doing at the White Rose
Yeah.
Resistance. And if you want to join the ministry, you can go to thewhiterose.life, thewhiterose.life, and you can become a monthly donor. You get a battle box in the mail to equip you for this fight. But really start with the book, educate yourself, buy some for your kids, your family members, your friends, your coworkers, and your pastors, and host a screening at your church. So that's
Yeah.
it.
Awesome. Well, I will link to as much of that as I can get my hands on in the show notes. And Seth, this has been extremely eye-opening and disturbing, but thank you for telling us about all the things that have been hidden for so long.
Well, and you're into natural health, so next time we'll talk about how abortion has led to breast cancer like you've never seen before in America,
Mhm.
preterm labor in subsequent pregnancies, and mental health in women. I can prove all of that.
Wonderful.
Abortion, firstly, is wrong because it kills little babies, but secondly, you wouldn't imagine what it's done to the public health of females in
Sure.
America, and that health information has also been hidden from us, and that's an episode for another time. But
Yeah.
thank you for your courage and having me on, and for your voice of truth.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much.